American boots on Ukrainian soil, Abrams tanks rolling eastward, and F-16s dominating the skies, all aimed squarely at pushing Russia back. It's the nightmare Russia's been saber-rattling about, and a scenario loaded with unpredictable consequences. Could this be the game-changer Ukraine needs, or the spark that lights a far bigger fire? 30 months in, and Russia's unbeatable forces are looking shakier than ever, especially after Ukraine's audacious move into Kursk. And while NATO's $250 billion lifeline has kept Ukraine in the fight, the latest US aid package, including fresh Patriots and those long-anticipated F-16s, may be tilting the balance even more. But if the US went further and deployed troops, that's a whole new ballgame. Buckle up as we dive into what could happen if America turned up the heat in Ukraine. If the US were to turn up the heat, Putin might finally get the wake-up call he's been dodging. But if the tides shift in Russia's favor again, Putin would likely throw everything he's got at Kharkiv or even Kyiv. After all, his first 2024 attempt at Kharkiv was a comical disaster, with poorly equipped infantry marching in without tank support, only to suffer massive losses and gain zero ground. Now he's banking on numbers to make up for, well, everything else. With Russia's new conscriptions pulling in 300,000 soldiers per year and contracted recruits swelling the ranks to 1.3 million, Putin might just go all in on a quantity over quality strategy, hoping to flood Kharkiv with sheer manpower. And that's exactly where the US might decide to step in and remind him why quality and strategy matter. Let's take a look at what an effective US deployment in Ukraine could actually achieve on the ground. First, just how many soldiers does the US have at its disposal? The answer is quite a lot. But not all of them will be trained for offensive missions. Currently, the US Army has roughly 450,000 active personnel, and the other branches of the US military make up the other 770,000 active service members. But most of these soldiers are stationed in the continental US or Hawaii. Most. Roughly 100,000 US troops form near-permanent contingents on military bases scattered across Europe, mainly in NATO countries. Of those, roughly 35,000 are stationed in Germany alone. These soldiers could be among the first ones to be redeployed from NATO countries, as their presence there is ostensibly to reinforce NATO defenses against Russia itself. However, the US is no stranger to military operations abroad, such as the nearly 20 years of fighting the war on terror in the Middle East. At the height of the surge of the war in Iraq, the US military deployed over 170,000 soldiers into the country, but personnel typically fluctuated between 100 and 150,000 troops for much of the war. With this estimate, it's not impossible to suggest that the US could be able to deploy as many as 100,000 soldiers to Ukraine relatively quickly to bolster local defenses and prevent Russia from going any further into the country. Of course, it likely wouldn't be just the soldiers themselves who made the difference in Ukraine, but the military equipment, vehicles, and planes that the US military would use. Some of the most notable additions that the US would almost certainly transport to Ukraine are more M1 Abrams tanks and M2 or M3 Bradley infantry support vehicles. In January 2023, Biden announced that the US was donating 31 Abrams tanks to Ukraine, more than enough to equip a full tank battalion. Since then, however, several of the tanks have been destroyed by Russian drones, but the US military is reported to have over 4,600 of these tanks in its ranks, half of which are currently on active duty and ready to be deployed. As for the Bradley support vehicles, they have already proven their worth in Ukraine by being able to destroy Russian tanks without additional support, and Ukraine received 186 of them as part of US aid packages. The US has around 2,100 M2 Bradleys and 1,200 M3 Bradleys in active duty, as well as the incredibly versatile Striker vehicles, which number over 4,000 in active duty. Even a fraction of these vehicles would be enough to multiply the land force on Ukraine's side of the conflict and push Russia back. Additionally, the US Army would likely bring a bulk of its anti-tank and anti-air defenses to the front lines, including the famous Patriots and Javelins. For a refresher, the Javelins are anti-tank, human-mounted fire-and-forget missiles, of which the US has sent at least 7,000 to Ukraine as part of the aid packages. They've been referred to as Saint Javelins due to their effectiveness at blowing up Soviet-made T-90 and older tanks. According to a report by the Center for Strategic and International Studies, or CSIS, the US likely has a stockpile of an additional 15,000 to 18,000 Javelins, ready to go, and can procure them at a maximum rate of roughly 6,500 a year. This means that if the US decides to order more Javelins to justify bringing more of its inventory to Ukraine, it would take only slightly over 4 years to get them back. On the anti-air front, it's not just Patriots that the US can bring to bear. The Stingers are considered last-generation missiles, with the US ordering fewer and fewer of them over the years. With an estimated 2,000 Stingers being sent to Ukraine over the past few years, it's likely that the US military has about 8,000 of these anti-air weapons in stock. Considering that the Department of Defense must issue a replacement for the Stinger, it wouldn't be surprising if the US Army decided to go all out and bring most of the stock against Russia before it becomes completely obsolete. Let's compare the current state of the Russian military for reference. According to most recent statistics, the Russian army has roughly 1.3 million active personnel. On paper, this is on par with the US forces. However, there's a huge difference between the US and Russian soldiers. For one, Russia uses a mixed conscription contract military service model. Based on the conscription numbers we suggested earlier, the most recent recruits are slightly slanted towards conscripts rather than contract soldiers. While that not might seem like much of a difference, it is, and for two simple reasons. First, Russian conscripts are not meant to be deployed on missions outside of Russia. That means that if the Russian forces can technically outnumber the combined Ukrainian army and what the US would realistically deploy, the amount of soldiers Putin can put inside Ukrainian territory is likely much smaller. But even more importantly, Russian conscripts aren't particularly well trained. Russian boot camps are nothing like the American basic combat training, and it's up to each unit to devise and monitor the training plan for recruits. In the past, this has led to significant differences in soldier training and competency across Russian units. In some cases, training officers were removed from their roles following multiple years of failing to abide by national military standards. According to some reports by the prisoners of war that were taken when Ukraine stormed the Kursk region, some conscripts receive as little as a week or two of basic training before being shoved to their posts. Furthermore, it pays to mention just how many losses Russia suffered over the course of the war. The Ukrainian Ministry of Defense reports an estimate of roughly 650,000 Russian casualties, deaths and injuries that prevent future military service. If we take the 1.3 million figure at face value and estimate that Russia has gained roughly as many soldiers as it's lost over the past 30 months, half of the manpower at Russia's disposal comes from fresh recruits. Finally, contract soldiers in Russia sign on for 2 years compared to the 4 that the US military contracts offer. All of these factors combined mean that the average Russian soldier is much less experienced and trained in actual warfare. And that's only on the manpower front. The Russian army has had significant difficulties creating forward momentum in Ukraine throughout 2024, all the while using some of the most modern weaponry and equipment at its disposal. But the equipment has proven to be less than reliable. For example, the Russian army's modern main battle tank, the T-90, should have been years ahead of what Ukraine had at the start of the war. However, NATO's donations of anti-tank missiles, particularly the aforementioned Javelins, and the advent of drone-based warfare have caused the T-90s to have little effect on the outcome of the battles. Compared to the Abrams tanks, T-90s have a deadly flaw. Their auto-loading systems keep spare ammunition below the turret and between the tracks, protected only by a relatively thin casing. The Ukrainians have used long-range missiles or drones to target the spare ammunition itself. When struck, the ammunition explodes, blowing up the tank from the inside out, a phenomenon sometimes dubbed explosive decapitation. Considering that the US Army will bring far more modern weaponry to the fray, the Russians won't really have a chance to compete on the ground. Plus, with the addition of more anti-tank systems, Russia will present little threat to the US-assisted Ukrainian defenses. Additionally, Ukraine has already been battering major Russian supply lines and ammo depots beyond the Donbas region with long-range artillery. Most recent examples include the September 18th and 21st attacks on 2 ammo depots near Toropets and Tikhoretsk, with satellite imagery showing depots up in flames as buildings nearby were practically leveled. If the US decides to take over the offensive part of the campaign as well, it can bring even more HIMARS and ATACMS long-range artillery capability. With those, it can likely make short work of cutting off Russia from the front line entirely. So in the optimistic scenario, the US brings some 100,000 to 150,000 troops and the accompanying tanks, missiles, and anti-tank and anti-air defenses to Ukraine. But what then? It's likely that the combined armies could feasibly repel the entirety of the Russian invasion force within as little as a few months. If Ukraine keeps up the tempo advantage it had gained by invading Kursk and landing long-range strikes on vital supply lines and military bases, the US presence can only improve its chances of succeeding. The US Army's more numerous anti-air systems can keep the incoming Russian missile strikes at bay, lowering the casualty rate for the Ukrainian side. Of course, this all implies that the US would be able to achieve the optimistic scenario, but it's highly likely that won't be the case. Instead, we must turn towards a more realistic scenario. If the US decides to go to Ukraine, Russia would have no choice but to declare war on the US in return. This would follow the most recent Russian doctrine of national security and defense, Simply put, with the US directly aiding Ukraine by planting its troops in Ukrainian territory, it would be sufficient grounds to acknowledge the action as the US having declared war on Russia. Now, the US being a part of NATO makes the resulting situation somewhat unclear. Since the US could be considered the oppressor in this case, deploying its troops against Russia, the fabled Article 5 would likely not trigger. As a result, the conflict would be between Russia and the US, but only for so long as Russia doesn't directly attack the US military bases or assets that are not part of Ukrainian defenses. However, even then, NATO's Article 4 may come into effect. Article 4 reads that the members will consult together whenever, in the opinion of any of them, the territorial integrity, political independence, or security of any of the members is threatened. The US could argue that Russia waging war with Ukraine in the US would inevitably threaten the security of either the US or NATO countries neighboring Russia. The slight vagueness of the wording doesn't help clear things up here, but regardless of what happens, the most likely endpoint is that Russia enters open warfare against the entire NATO coalition. In this case, the US would have much more freedom of operations in what it can do against Russia. Additionally, since many NATO countries have been gearing up their military presence in case of Russia's aggression, Russia would end up getting invaded on multiple fronts, with minimal options of returning fire. One of the most hotly contested such fronts would surround Kaliningrad. This is a Russian exclave buried between NATO countries on all sides, and one that has seen heavily increased militarization during the 2010s. A 2018 report by the Federation of American Scientists suggested that a modernized nuclear weapons bunker in the exclave would suggest Russia is moving some of its advanced weaponry there. Kaliningrad's proximity to the Baltic states would suggest that Russia would initially plan a two-pronged attack on Lithuania through Kaliningrad and Belarus. However, since Poland is one of NATO's most militarized members, it would likely be the first counter-responder to any hostile actions in the region. Then Finland and Sweden, the two newest NATO members, could come in from the north to fortify the Baltic states, as well as prevent Kaliningrad's fleet from being able to operate within the Baltic Sea. In some estimates, NATO would occupy the entire Kaliningrad region within 2 weeks. Cut off from the Russian mainland, the exclave would likely firmly remain under NATO's control throughout the next phase of the war, going deeper into Russia. After that, the defensive war in Ukraine would likely turn into a NATO offensive in Russia, and the outcome of this one can be tricky to estimate. One of the main reasons behind the uncertainty is that countries have a terrible track record of invading Russia, particularly when winter is coming. The hopeful invaders include the Swedish, the French, and the Germans, twice. Every time the Russians managed to repel the invasion before it could reach Moscow. Modern weaponry and tactics are likely to change the equation though, with artillery capable of reaching hundreds of miles inland and long-range missiles and drones being able to travel for more than 1,000 miles, the US forces could wreak havoc on Russian cities long before land troops would even step into Russian territory. And the US would likely have no other option but to make a decisive first strike or risk doing the same thing Russia did in Ukraine in 2022, ineffectively attacking Ukraine and causing an attrition war. The bulk of the US and NATO strategy will be focused on reaching Moscow and eliminating the Kremlin, for one simple reason. The Russian military's morale is currently at an all-time low. Putin's war has caused hundreds of thousands of deaths and has led to one of the largest waves of emigration out of Russia. If Moscow gets threatened directly, it's highly likely that the system that keeps Putin in power, Russian oligarchs controlling the major industries, would remove him from power first. In that scenario, the war against Russia could lead to a significant ideological shift, forcing Russia to align itself with the West's politics or face more losses than the country can bear to recover from. Somewhat unfortunately, this could create a string of issues for the US, particularly pertaining to China. When Russia invaded Ukraine, the West quickly cut off trade between Russia and Europe. Then China became Russia's biggest trading partner, achieving a record high of $240 billion in trade value in 2023. But the partnership is twofold. Russia gets significant flows of money to fuel its war machine and make headway in Ukraine via sheer quantity. China gets access to Russia's oil and gas prices far below what Europe was paying just a year before. If the US forces Russia to back out of the war by remaking the country's government, China would likely lose its major trading partner and natural resource stockpile. Considering that the US also has a stranglehold on the Strait of Malacca, which sees most of the naval trade between China and the Middle East and Africa, China could see a NATO attack on Russia as directly going against its own security. Thus, in a somewhat roundabout way, the US going into Ukraine could eventually lead to China declaring war on the US. With NATO triggering Article 5 again, the US allies in the Indo-Pacific, India, Japan, and Australia being a part of the Quad, this would herald World War III. In this case, it would be impossible to predict what will happen. If China already has plans to protect Russia from NATO aggression, it could step in as soon as the US troops come into Ukraine, jump-starting the process before NATO occupies Kaliningrad. China's first moves could be against Japan and Taiwan, forcing the US Navy, Air Force, and Marine Corps to be deployed to the East China Sea to shore up the Japanese and Taiwanese defenses. Then the US would have less of an opportunity to improve Ukraine's situation. Regardless, the resulting conflict would quickly overtake the current Russo-Ukrainian war in the number of casualties per day, and all involved parties would incur heavy losses before they could make any headway. And that's just the second scenario. Throughout this entire video, we've purposely omitted one big variable that both the US and Russia can utilize to their advantage: nuclear weapons. It's assumed that Russia wouldn't drop nukes on Ukraine. After all, Putin has repeatedly tried to stave off NATO from assisting Ukraine, even indirectly, by saber-rattling using its nuclear arsenal. In the newest versions of Russia's military doctrine, if a nuclear power helps a non-nuclear power in a war against Russia, Russia would have sufficient grounds to escalate the conflict to nuclear warfare. The US knows this, and the only way to prevent a full-out nuclear war would be to strike first. The US and Russia both have over 5,000 nuclear warheads available to them, which are scattered across their respective countries and in submarines roaming the oceans. Out of those, it's estimated that both countries also have 1,700 deployed warheads, ready to fire at a moment's notice. But ultimately, who strikes first doesn't really matter. The modern detection systems for nuclear missile launches are so precise that both US and Russia can detect a missile launch within 10 minutes. That's not enough time for an intercontinental nuclear missile to reach and destroy a heavily fortified nuclear missile silo. A simulation by the Future of Life Institute shows that both nuclear powers would likely start with EMP missiles to try to disable one another's electrical grids and further prevent missile launches. Half an hour later, the bulk of intercontinental missiles would strike key military targets such as bases or nuclear silos. The next targets would be major cities to prevent the governments from recovering. NATO's Article 5 would come into effect, which would embroil Russia in a war against the UK and France. With both of those countries having nukes of their own, Russia would need to launch strikes against them first, which only causes more reactive measures to trigger. Regardless of who fires first, the results are devastating. Simulations suggest that most of the northern hemisphere would be covered in nuclear fallout. The simulation also suggests that 5 billion people would die from either nuclear blasts or widespread famine that follows when the hemisphere becomes practically inhospitable for agriculture. The average temperatures in the north would drop by 20 degrees Fahrenheit, causing a significant climate shift and culling the remaining population. The southern hemisphere is slightly better off, but the world order would likely be changed forever. And that's precisely why the US has been hesitant to upscale its efforts to provide more direct aid to Ukraine. While Putin's saber-rattling so far has been purely perfunctory, an actual aggressive action, such as US troops landing in Ukraine, might finally cause him to snap. And considering that the other option is for the Kremlin to bow down to either the US or China, Putin might just take the more destructive way out. If Putin can't take Ukraine, nobody will be able to have Ukraine, because nuclear bombs would make Ukraine disappear, much like many other Northern Hemisphere countries. But what do you think? Will the US try to escalate the matters in Ukraine? Will Russia decide enough is enough and accept defeat? Let us know in the comments, and thank you for watching. Now go and check out 800,000 NATO and US military troops ready to enter Ukraine, or click this other video instead.